Hello and welcome, I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. Leaders of the group of 7 nations are gathering today in the Canadian Rockies for a crucial summit amid sharp divisions with the United States. Hosted by Prime Minister Mark Carney in Kananaskis, the meeting faces tense undercurrents over trade disputes, Middle East escalations and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Israel's latest airstrikes on Iran, which killed scores just hours ago, have thrown foreign policy into the spotlight. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz says the Iran-Israel conflict will be high on the summit's agenda, alongside efforts to prevent nuclear escalation. Prime Minister Mark Carney is pushing for stability, job creation and mineral supply chains, but with President Trump in attendance, diplomats are bracing for a potential confrontation. Many are recalling Trump's infamous exit from the 2018 summit and hoping to avoid a repeat. The summit runs through to Tuesday, with world leaders including Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky and India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi expected to join. For parts of the discussions, well, this summit at a moment of geopolitical instability across continents, of course in the spotlight, as we've mentioned, the current Israel-Iran tensions, but lots more to discuss. Joining us is Ross Feingold, political analyst, who's joining us from Taipei. Ross, thank you ever so much for taking the time to speak with us on this special show where we're looking at this G7 summit. Let's start with that talking point, the big geopolitical incidents, the ongoing Israel-Iran tensions. What's the significance of this happening at a meeting where not just the leaders of the group of 7, but also other pivotal and important nations are going to be taking place? Hello, Ross. I believe, could you unmute? Is that possible?
Yeah. The significance, first and foremost, is that it's going to take up a lot of the time. It's going to take up a lot of the agenda. Originally, I'm sure the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza would have taken up some time on the agenda, but they have so many other issues they want to discuss, trade being one of them, countering China probably being another issue that several of the countries want to discuss, various other environmental issues that are important to some of the participants, although not important to President Trump. But now they're going to be devoting a lot of time to the Israel-Iran war. It's not what the G7 is really meant to be talking about. But unfortunately for the participants, they have no choice. They're going to be spending a lot of time talking about this depending on what happens in the coming hours.
Yes, absolutely. An escalation is possible. Benjamin Netanyahu talking about this lasting potentially weeks. Also Iran saying that they will continue to strike Israel in the manner that they have until those hostilities stop. Of course, for the region itself, this is completely destabilizing, but there are wider ramifications. G7 nations have already been involved in talk from Iran, the US, the UK and France, notably. How important is a united Western front in the face of an escalation that could spill over to not just a regional dispute, but a wider global dispute with the US keenly involved?
Realistically speaking, there's probably not going to be much of a united Western front, starting with the fact that the United States is such a close supporter of Israel. Although President Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, they rushed to say that the United States was not involved with Israel's attack. But be that as it may, the United States is still a key supporter of Israel. It goes without saying. They're a weapons supplier to Israel. And if Iran continues its missile and drone attacks on Israel, it's possible that the United States military might get involved in the coming hours or days. The message that might come from other G7 or the guest participating countries is going to be very different than what a United States message is going to be. So I think the idea of a united front, while that might be good if it actually happens, I think that's going to be extraordinarily difficult. And also keep in mind that some of the G7 countries, as well as other participants in this meeting, like South Africa, have been very critical of Israel's conduct of the war against Hamas in Gaza. So it's not a moment when some of these countries have great sympathy for Israel.
Ross, you of course join us from Taipei. China is potentially a topic of discussion with rising tensions in the region, further military drills in the South China Sea. Japan have spoken about those as well. How significant is the issue of China, not just in geopolitics, but also with trade as well? Of course, trade tensions, a key topic we expect to be discussed as well.
China is a hugely important topic for the G7. They've been talking about de-risking from China for many years already, all the way back to the first Trump administration. The United States, in the first Trump administration, put a lot of pressure on G7 partners to decouple or de-risk from China. And it's taken some of those countries some time, but I think it's fair to say that most of the G7 participants do have the mindset of de-risking or decoupling from China, but then these countries have to work together to actually achieve that. On the other hand, with the potential of trade friction between the United States and some of the G7 countries, there is a recent effort by some of those European countries to open a new door with China, to recalibrate that relationship and to make it somewhat less antagonistic. And the reason why they're doing that is they want to trade with China. They want to make money. They want their companies to be able to invest and make money in China, and they have to be willing to let Chinese goods come into their country. So the reality is, over the last few months, we've seen some movement by Europe, possibly because of friction with the United States, that they seem more open to a trade relationship once again with China. So how to balance de-risking or decoupling with their desire to make money in China is something to watch at this G7 meeting. But there's definitely a trend with some of those European countries like Germany and France, and even recently the UK. They've shown a new willingness to do business with China recently.
Yes, and moving from Chinese trade, I want to move to Europe. Of course, Ursula von der Leyen is going to be present at this summit. The EU have been, as far as we're aware, locked in negotiations with the US administration, but also Ursula von der Leyen has been extremely vocal on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. What do you think the EU agenda will be and the EU goals heading towards this summit?
They better have some very modest goals, because unlike previous G7 meetings under President Biden, when we saw very united and very strong support for Ukraine, and that was reflected in the conversations as well as the joint statements made at G7 meetings, that's not going to come from President Trump. Even though Ukraine President Zelensky is going to be there in person, we should not expect President Trump to sign on to anything that's even vaguely similar to previous G7 statements about support for Ukraine. So that's definitely something to watch. But I think President Trump is going to be very, very conservative and careful about making any commitments when it comes to weapons or support for Ukraine.
Yes, so let's build on that, Ross. Of course, Canada hosting this G7 summit. They are part of the several nations involved in the coalition of the willing. The UK and France deeply involved, with Ursula von der Leyen there as well. How key an issue will this be? And do you think we might see any resolutions over a clear messaging with the United States backing over this 30-day ceasefire, as talks of further direct talks between Russia and Ukraine are there, but an understanding of peace seems to be distant?
I think the European leaders, when they meet together without President Trump, they're going to have productive conversations, and they're going to remain united when it comes to supporting Ukraine, whether that's through cash or through weapons. And when it comes to calling on a ceasefire, that might be where they could have some common messaging with the United States. But again, when it comes to arming Ukraine, I think President Trump is going to be very hesitant to agree to any of that. So we're going to see some disunity from the G7 countries on that topic, even if we might see some unified messaging when it comes, broadly speaking, to calling on Ukraine and Russia to agree to a ceasefire.
Yes, we know that South Africa are going to be present. Ramaphosa, of course, was in the Oval Office with President Trump, going through an interesting experience, being played videos, talk of white genocide, interesting topics. What is South Africa's role in this discussion? What are their aims? What are their goals? And how will they contribute as a nation that, of course, is on the cusp of those G7?
Having recently met with President Trump, and as you said, the meeting was certainly interesting. Not much came out of it in a positive way for President Ramaphosa. So I think he's going to look at the opportunity to meet with the other leaders and expand his personal relationship with the European leaders and with Canada and the other non-G7 attendees. But frankly, I think he's going to try and stay far away from President Trump other than shaking his hand.
Yes. Let's look at President Trump. Of course, he is currently facing difficulty in the United States. Protests that aligned with his military parade marking his 79th birthday and also the 250th anniversary of the US Army. Trump often feels like and acts like and speaks like he holds the cards in all of these geopolitical situations. We saw a tweet from him earlier talking about the Iran-Israel, sorry, I clarify, Truth Social, not tweet, where he was talking about getting a deal done similar to the one that was made between Pakistan and India. Do you think he's going to use this summit to continue that message that he is in charge of these situations, he is the peacemaker, and putting himself front and centre of the concerning geopolitical situations that are ongoing?
The President of the United States, regardless of who it is always going to be front and center at these kind of international meetings, perhaps Trump even more so because of his personality, his speaking style, and his use of social media. It's true, as you said, that the Trump administration and Secretary of State Rubio specifically were instrumental in bringing a quick end to the Pakistan-India hostilities. But that's a very different situation compared to Israel and Iran, because the United States has a relationship with both India and Pakistan. Obviously, the United States doesn't have that kind of relationship with Iran, and frankly, Prime Minister Netanyahu won't be willing to end the hostilities as long as he thinks there's more to do or that he has the upper hand. If there's still facilities that Israel feels it has to take out, they're going to continue to do that. It's going to be very difficult to bring about an end to the hostilities this quickly. I would expect it to go on for at least a few more days, possibly while the G7 are still talking. And remember, President Trump's record, he got the peace or the armistice ceasefire between India and Pakistan, but he hasn't gotten one between Israel and Hamas or between Russia and Ukraine. So he has a mixed record on that front.
Yes, Ross, I'm glad that you brought Israel, Hamas into this conversation, because the recent Middle Eastern escalations and developments have sort of put that in the shadows. But there is still a reported humanitarian crisis going on the ground in Gaza. Before the flare-up between Israel and Iran, there was widespread Western condemnation of the ongoing situation in Israel. Do you think that will still be a point raised? Do you think there will still be conversations from leaders who have openly spoken out against Israel with the United States, who of course aligned with Israel and supporting Israel in all of their actions?
It will definitely come up in the conversation, but you could be assured that it's going to get less time than it would have without the flare-up of hostilities between Israel and Iran. So they'll talk about it, but they're not going to be able to talk about it as much as they want to, keeping in mind the European countries also want to talk at length about Ukraine and Russia, and they have all the other issues like trade, for example, that they need to talk about, or China, et cetera, et cetera. So that's unfortunate for the civilians in Gaza. Clearly, there's a need to bring in more aid. But there also would be a lot of pushback from President Trump. He's going to say that first, it's Hamas's fault. They're not agreeing to the ceasefire that the United States has proposed, which would allow much more aid to get in. And Hamas won't agree to that ceasefire because it's not a permanent end to the war. It's only a temporary ceasefire. And Hamas insists that the only agreement they want to sign is one that brings about an end to the war. Well, Israel and the United States are not going to agree to that kind of ceasefire. And then also the United States is going to say, we've arranged for this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to operate in Gaza. It's unfortunate that the United Nations and some of the other key stakeholder countries have an animosity towards this setup. But at the moment, it's the only available organization that is distributing food aid. And the United States attitude is going to be work with us, work with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is on the ground and trying to distribute food. Stop trying to push for some other alternative model that neither the United States nor Israel are going to agree to.
Yes, Ross, we've detailed several areas in the world where hostilities are underway, where wars are being fought, where humanitarian crises are ongoing. But on a defence front, it's something that several discussions have been had. NATO Chief Mark Rutte talking about a need to up defence spending, the US also being clear that a certain level should be met in the face of uncertainty and potential adversity. How significant will that be in this summit? Do you think there will be discussions about defence spending in the face of wars across continents?
It might come up, but also keep in mind that later this month is the NATO summit in The Hague. So President Trump will be attending that. As of now, he's attending it in person. And that's really going to be the NATO discussion about increased defense spending. And I think President Trump is really going to give it to the other NATO leaders at that meeting. He's going to be very direct in telling them that they need to spend more on their defense. Will he bring it up at this meeting? It's possible. The United States views on, for example, Australia, not a NATO country, but recently Secretary of Defense Hegseth was very direct in telling Australia, to use one example, that they have to significantly increase their defense spending. And the Prime Minister of Australia, Prime Minister Albanese, basically said, we'll decide on our own what our